His name was Frederick Barber Campbell. He was 62 years old, a Harvard Law School graduate, class of 1894, a partner in the firm Campbell and Whip, with offices at 20 Exchange Place in Lower Manhattan, 3 blocks from the New York Stock Exchange. He had a desk, a set of legal briefs, and a private membership at the Metropolitan Club, the social institution founded in 1891 by J.P. Morgan himself. Frederick Campbell was not a speculator. He was not a hoarder. He was a man who, over 2 careful visits to Chase National Bank, had deposited 27 bars of gold bullion, each cast and stamped by the United States Treasury for safekeeping in the bank's vault. October 1932, January 1933. 13 bars first, then 14 more. The total more than 5,000 troy ounces, valued at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce, at approximately $135,000. A very large sum. A sum that represented a lifetime of careful accumulation. He was not hiding it. The bank had receipts. Chase had signed an agreement in writing to return those bars on demand. He would demand them in September 1933. The bank would refuse. The next day, a federal grand jury would indict Frederick Barber Campbell for a crime that did not exist when he deposited those bars 6 months earlier. The crime of owning his own gold. This is not a story about the Great Depression. It is a story about what governments do when the monetary system they have built becomes incompatible with their survival. It is a story about how the legal apparatus that protects private property can be suspended, reclassified, and reversed in the space of a single executive signature. And it is a story that did not end in 1933. The same mechanism, emergency declaration forced exchange at below-market rates followed by revaluation, has appeared in Britain in 1966, in India in 1968. And in every case where a government controlled the monetary system and faced a debt it could not otherwise escape. The pattern is structural. The outcome is predictable. The warning signs are bureaucratic, not chaotic. They always sound like stabilization. To understand what happened to Frederick Campbell and what the 26 days between April 5th and May 1, 1933 actually reveal about how governments manage monetary crises, you have to understand the trap the American monetary system had built for itself by 1929. The United States was on the gold standard. That meant one thing in practice. Every Federal Reserve note in circulation had to be backed by gold at a ratio of 40%. If the Federal Reserve held $10 billion in gold, it could issue no more than $25 billion in currency. The gold was not decoration. It was a legal ceiling on money creation. And by the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve had nearly reached that ceiling. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average losing 13% in a single day on October 28th, then another 12% the following day, the banking system began to fracture. Depositors withdrew cash. Banks, which held only a fraction of deposits in reserve, began to fail. Between 1930 and 1932, more than 5,000 American banks suspended operations. In that environment, the citizens who still had savings did what any rational person would do. They converted paper into the only thing that couldn't be printed. They converted their dollars into gold. Here is what blows people's minds about this. The very act of protecting yourself from a failing monetary system was, in the logic of that system, the thing that made the system fail faster. Every ounce of gold withdrawn from the banking system tightened the ceiling on Federal Reserve money creation. The more people protected themselves, the less capacity existed to stabilize the banks. It was a trap built into the architecture of the system itself. And by March 1933, Franklin Roosevelt understood that there were only 2 ways out: default on the debts of the United States government, or take the gold. He chose the gold. On March 9, 1933, his 6th day in office, Roosevelt signed the Emergency Banking Act. Congress passed it the same day, before most members had read it. The act invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime statute that had never been repealed, and authorized the president to regulate, restrict, and prohibit transactions in gold. It also retroactively legalized Roosevelt's declaration of a national banking emergency 3 days earlier, on March 6, when he had ordered every bank in the United States to close. The bank holiday, Roosevelt told the nation in a fireside chat, was temporary, necessary, a stabilization measure. The word he used for citizens who were withdrawing gold was hoarders. Hoarding in the language of that emergency was unfashionable. The word was intentional. It was chosen to shift the moral frame from property rights to civic duty. Frederick Campbell was listening. He had no particular reason to worry. His gold bars were in a vault at Chase National Bank. They were stored, not hoarded. He had paid the storage fee. He had receipts. The bank had a written obligation to return them on demand. He continued his work at 20 Exchange Place. On April 5, 1933, 26 days after the Emergency Banking Act, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order was 2 pages long. It cited the Trading with the Enemy Act. It did not use the word confiscation. It used the phrase delivery requirements. All persons were required to deliver, on or before May 1, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates in their possession to a Federal Reserve Bank in exchange for $20.67 per troy ounce. The deadline was 26 days from the date of the order. The penalty for non-compliance was a fine of up to $10,000, equivalent to approximately $240,000 today, or up to 10 years in prison or both. The order included exemptions: gold required for industrial or professional use, gold coins with recognized numismatic value, and each person could retain gold coin and certificates up to $100, roughly 5 ounces. But gold bullion stored in a bank vault held by a private individual under a written storage contract, that was subject to the order. Frederick Campbell read the order. He was a lawyer. He read it carefully. He concluded that his 27 bars of gold bullion held in bailment at Chase National Bank did not qualify for any exemption. He also concluded that the order was unconstitutional. He was the kind of man who did not quietly comply with what he believed to be illegal. He would wait. He would continue paying the storage fee. He would see how this played out. He is wrong. On September 16, 1933, Frederick Barber Campbell walked into Chase National Bank and demanded his gold, all 27 bars. The bank's vice president sent him a letter the same day. They regretted they were not in a position to deliver the gold. They had already filed a return with the Collector of Internal Revenue, disclosing Campbell's holdings as required by the President's August order. They were legally obligated to surrender the metal to the government. The gold that Campbell had purchased, paid to store, and held under a written contract of bailment was no longer available to him. On September 26, Campbell filed a civil lawsuit against Chase National Bank in United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, demanding the return of his property. On September 27, 18 minutes after the grand jury convened, federal prosecutors secured a criminal indictment against Frederick Barber Campbell for failing to register his gold with the federal government. A second indictment followed, charging actual hoarding. Campbell was now facing a possible 20 years in prison, a $20,000 fine, and the confiscation of every ounce of metal he owned. His response was to represent himself, pro se, in federal court, against the United States Attorney's Office. Thomas Dewey, the same Thomas Dewey who would later become governor of New York and twice run for president, was one of the prosecutors on the brief. Federal Judge John M. Woolsey ultimately ruled on the criminal indictment. He did not rule that the gold confiscation was unconstitutional. He ruled that the indictment was technically invalid because Executive Order 6102 had been signed by the President rather than the Secretary of the Treasury, as required by the Emergency Banking Act. The prosecution of Campbell under that specific order failed, but the court simultaneously upheld the federal government's authority to seize gold. Campbell's 27 bars, more than 5,000 troy ounces, valued at $135,000 when he deposited them, were confiscated. He received paper dollars in return, at $20.67 per ounce. Here is the number that matters. On January 31, 1934, 115 days after Campbell's indictment, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act and simultaneously issued a proclamation revaluing gold from $20.67 to $35 per troy ounce, a 69% increase in the statutory price of gold. Overnight, the 5,000 troy ounces that had been taken from Frederick Campbell at $20.67 per ounce were now worth $35 per ounce. The dollars Campbell had received in exchange had just lost 41% of their gold value. His gold had not lost value. The dollar used to pay him had been deliberately devalued against the gold it had just purchased. Not theory, not speculation. Historical fact. The Treasury's gain from this single repricing was documented. The revaluation of all gold acquired from private citizens and the Federal Reserve at $20.67 per ounce, then repriced to $35 per ounce, generated a surplus of approximately $2 per ounce. $81 billion. That figure is not a rough estimate. It is the number the Roosevelt administration used to capitalize the newly created Exchange Stabilization Fund, $2 billion of the $2. $81 billion surplus was placed into the fund on the day the Gold Reserve Act was signed, giving the Treasury direct capacity to manage currency values without Federal Reserve approval. The Federal Reserve, for its part, received gold certificates with no specified monetary value in exchange for the gold the government had taken from it. The Washington Post, whose publisher had been a former Federal Reserve Board governor, wrote that Roosevelt's reassuring letter to the Fed looked like a eulogy. The institution, they noted, had been shorn of its ability to formulate an independent credit policy. The Gold Reserve Act had not merely taken the system's gold, it had permanently altered the institutional relationship between the Treasury and the central bank. Quick pause. If you are beginning to see the mechanism, not the event, the mechanism, hit subscribe. This is the Money Architect. I do not tell you what to buy. I show you how the system was built, who designed the trap, and who walked away when it closed. It is free, unlike the lesson Frederick Campbell paid in 1933. Here is the mechanism, stated plainly because it is the same mechanism every time. Step 1. A fiscal or monetary crisis creates political urgency. Step 2. Emergency powers are invoked under legislation that most people have forgotten exists. Step 3. A forced exchange occurs at below market rates, framed as stabilization. Step 4. The rate is adjusted upward after the exchange is complete. Step 5. The difference between the exchange rate and the adjusted rate becomes government revenue. The citizens who complied received paper at $20.67. The government they complied with held gold at $35. That gap, 69%, was not a coincidence. It was the point. The same pattern, with local variations, appeared in 4 other countries within 35 years of Roosevelt's order. In Australia in 1959, the central bank was given the authority to compel the surrender of private gold holdings. Citizens were required to hand over gold bullion to the Reserve Bank at official rates. The restriction remained in force for 17 years. The legal instrument was the Banking Act of 1959. The stated rationale was monetary stability. The practical mechanism was identical: forced exchange at official rates, followed by administrative control of the asset. In India, in 1962, Finance Minister Morarji Desai introduced the Gold Control Act. The border dispute with China had created a foreign exchange crisis. The government needed hard currency. Desai recalled all gold loans made by banks and banned forward trading. In 1963, the production of gold jewelry above 14-carat fineness was prohibited. The government launched a gold bond scheme in 1965, offering tax immunity for gold surrendered, which failed to attract compliance. Desai finally formalized the restrictions with the Gold Control Act of August 1968, which prohibited citizens from owning gold in the form of bars or coins. All existing holdings had to be converted into jewelry and declared to authorities. The act remained in force for 22 years until 1990. In Britain in 1966, the Wilson government introduced exchange control regulations prohibiting private ownership of gold coins bought after 1966. The restriction was framed as a balance of payments measure. The pound was under severe pressure. Citizens who already held gold coins were required to register their holdings with the Bank of England and prove they were genuine coin collectors to retain them. The restriction remained until 1979. The stated purpose in each case was the same word, stability. The mechanism in each case was the same sequence. Identify the asset, invoke emergency authority, establish a mandatory exchange, set the rate, adjust later. Here is what the Campbell case actually shows, and why it is more precise than the general story usually told about EO 6102. The popular version presents the gold confiscation as a mass seizure, enforced door to door, with federal agents hunting down ordinary citizens. That version is inaccurate in its details, though accurate in its essence. There were no systematic searches of homes. Enforcement relied substantially on voluntary compliance. The mechanism was not primarily coercive, it was structural. The banks, which held most of the gold, were required to report and surrender. The gold already inside the system was captured by the system. The individual who had placed his gold inside the banking system for safekeeping under a written contract found that the contract was not a protection. It was a disclosure. Frederick Campbell's 27 bars were at Chase National Bank, not under a floorboard. They were in the most visible, most documented, most accessible possible location. His belief that the storage contract gave him a private right to his property was not naive, it was reasonable. It reflected a legal system in which property rights and contractual obligations were understood to constrain government action. The emergency changed that relationship, not permanently and not without constitutional controversy. The Supreme Court in the Gold Clause cases of 1935 narrowly upheld Roosevelt's gold program by a 5-4 margin. 4 justices believed the government's actions were unconstitutional. The majority held that they were not. The margin was a single vote. Campbell fought his case until he died. He received his paper dollars. He never received his gold. Now here is the modern parallel. The United States government currently holds approximately 261 million troy ounces of gold in reserves, primarily at Fort Knox, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and West Point. Lead gold is carried on the government's official books at $42.22 per troy ounce, the statutory price established in 1973. Current market price as of 2026 is approximately $3,100 per troy ounce. The difference between the book price and the market price represents an unrealized accounting surplus of roughly $800 billion held in a government asset that is legally valued at 1.4% of its market worth. This is not coincidence. It is the residue of the 1934 repricing compounded by decades of deliberate non-adjustment. The U.S. gold reserve is, in accounting terms, the largest undervalued asset on any government's balance sheet on Earth. The legal authority to reprice that asset, to conduct a revaluation, exists within the framework established in 1934. Congress has not repealed it. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, capitalized by the original revaluation, still exists. The statutory mechanism for adjusting the official gold price is not a historical artifact. It is current law. The pattern is mathematical. The outcome is structural. What the Roosevelt gold program established and what the Campbell case illustrates with a specificity that the general story obscures is that the distinction between property held inside the financial system and property held outside it is not incidental. It is the entire mechanism. The gold in the vault at Chase National Bank was disclosed, documented, and contractually obligated to be returned. Those three features made it capturable. The numismatic coins held by private collectors were exempt, not because the government was generous, because coins with specialized collector value were difficult to price, difficult to standardize, and resistant to forced exchange at a uniform rate. The exemption was not about liberty, it was about administrative convenience. The same logic applies to every subsequent asset class that governments have sought to control in moments of fiscal emergency. The asset that is registered is the asset that is reachable. The asset that is institutionally held is the asset that can be captured through institutional instruction. This is not theory, it is the documented mechanism of 1933. 1959, 1966, and 1968. It is the mechanism of financial repression, a term economists use to describe the process by which governments erode the real value of assets or capture returns from private holders without formal taxation or outright default. In 2020 and 2021, the Federal Reserve created more than $4 trillion in new monetary base. The M2 money supply increased by 40% between February 2020 and February 2022. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, the highest rate since November 1981. The Fed raised rates to fight it. Regional banks, which had purchased long-duration government bonds during the low-rate period, found their balance sheets insolvent as rates rose. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank failed. The FDIC took it over. The Fed created a new emergency lending facility, the Bank Term Funding Program, within 48 hours, injecting liquidity to prevent contagion. Tightening paused. Here is the brutal math. The United States currently holds approximately $36 trillion in federal debt. Interest payments on that debt exceeded $1 trillion in fiscal year 2024, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare. If interest rates remain elevated, the Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs approaching $16 trillion annually by 2034. Tax revenue runs approximately $4-5 trillion per year. At current trajectory, interest alone will consume more than a third of all tax revenue within a decade. The same three exits that existed in 1933 exist today. Default, austerity, managed devaluation. The historical record on which exit governments choose is unambiguous. The 261 million ounces of gold still carried on the government's books at $42.22 per ounce is not a curiosity. It is an option, not a certain one, not an imminent one, but a documented, legally available option that has been executed once before in American history, generating $281 billion in Treasury revenue in a single day, at 1934 scale. At 2026 scale, with gold priced at current market levels, a revaluation of the official book price to market value would generate an accounting surplus of over $800 billion, without taxation, without legislation beyond a presidential proclamation, the same instrument Roosevelt used on January 31, 1934. Same pattern, same stages, same outcome. Frederick Campbell's 27 bars of gold sit in some transformed form in the reserves that underpin the current system. The dollars he received in exchange for them in 1933 at $20.67 per ounce bought less with each passing decade. His legal fight established, through the courts and through congressional legislation, both the government's authority and its limits. Gold ownership was restored in 1974, 41 years after the order that took Campbell's bars. Congress removed the president's authority to regulate gold transactions in peacetime in 1977. The exemptions and the precedents and the legal frameworks were documented in Federal Register entries and court decisions that most Americans have never read. Campbell never recovered his gold. He recovered his standing as the man who established through his own prosecution that the order was technically defective, forcing Roosevelt to issue a corrected order under a different signature, and who simultaneously proved that the gold, even when the prosecution failed, was not returned. He won the legal argument. He lost the gold. The mechanism that took it was not violence, it was paperwork. Executive Order 6102, Emergency Banking Act, Gold Reserve Act, Exchange Stabilization Fund. 7 words per title. The system was legal every step of the way. The language of the order did not say we are taking your gold. It said delivery requirements. The language of the revaluation did not say we just erased 41% of the value of the dollars we gave you. It said stabilization. The gap between the language and the reality is not accidental. It is the mechanism. History shows one thing clearly about the moments when governments restructure the relationship between citizens and their stores of value. The people who understood the mechanism before the order was signed retained optionality. The people who trusted the storage contract at Chase National Bank discovered that the contract was readable by the same institution that issued the order. Frederick Campbell believed his written agreement with Chase was a protection. What the emergency revealed is that in a monetary crisis, the institutions that hold your assets and the institutions that issue the emergency orders exist within the same legal architecture. They respond to the same authority. The pattern is mathematical. The outcome is structural. The warning signs are not the emergency declarations. By the time those come, the mechanism is already in motion. The warning signs are the conditions that make emergency declarations rational for governments: unsustainable debt, political inability to cut spending, a central bank that cannot raise rates without destabilizing the fiscal position. Those conditions are not coming, they are present now. The question is not whether governments that face them will use the tools available to them. The question is whether you will have read the executive orders, the Gold Reserve Act, and the Campbell case before they do. Now go read the legal instruments before someone invokes them on your behalf.